Hey y'all, I'm Ashley, a black woman and forever a black girl from the south side of Chicago. Growing up, the women in my family taught me the importance of creating my own space to cultivate joy and express my creativity. I found that space at the skating rink. The skating rink for me was a portal that transported me back from girlhood to the infinite possibilities of being a black woman and back again. I rolled through the sounds of black music while the bright lights illuminated my dark skin as the cool air brushed through my coily hair, giving me a sense of what freedom feels like. Just like the wheels of a roller skate, our lives take us on new journeys. And my journey has led me here to the Rolling Archives podcast, a digital scrapbook of black girlhood, a celebration of the magic we are made of as we float through the ups and downs and journey through black girlhood on our own terms. Hey y'all, I'm gonna ask you to roll with me for a moment. So, I'm asking you to take a short trip back with me in the midst of the pandemic, quarantining, social distancing, when I started to imagine what would become the rolling archives. The pandemic put me in a deeply reflective space, and in so many ways, I was returning to myself. I had just finished my PhD, moved across the country, and started a new job and was building community with Black girls. But in my moments alone, I kept returning to my younger self and thinking about the places that made me feel safe and most at home. I realized that was the skating rink and in my grandmother's garden. So let me just back it up a little bit and tell you about my experiences as a young Black girl. I struggled a lot growing up with my identity, whether it be through internalized anti Blackness or internalized colorism. I was often called names like darky or blacky when I had interests in other childhood partners. I often heard, "You're really pretty for a dark skinned girl," or "You're really cool. I would date you, but I actually don't date dark skinned girls." And so that really put me in a space of just feeling like I was never enough or that I couldn't possibly be enough to one, exist, but also to experience love. And so when I took that on myself, I also started to doubt who I was. And I just didn't like myself at all as a child. But I will say, once I started skating, at, let's say, I was in seventh or eighth grade. I was in middle school. I was questioning everything about who I was. I immediately fell in love with this art and this practice. And so I would watch folks at the skating rink. And growing up in Chicago, the style of skating that we did is called JB skating. And so it's a very intricate type of skating. It's very challenging, learning the routines, the musicality, the technique. It can be really, really difficult. So I will say that I was trained as a JB skater. I took a lot of classes. I had amazing instructors that were Black women, Black men. But just being in the rink, seeing the way that the lights move, the way the music moved through people's bodies, I just wanted to be great at it. And that was actually the space where how I felt outside of the skating rink never really mattered to me. I didn't think too much about not being capable or not being enough to put on my skates and just roll around. And so, as I became more experienced in the craft, it actually took me to heights that were much greater than I even imagined for myself. But I would sit there, watch other folks skate, and within the skating rink, it's very real that men and boys and masculine folks are more talented because they're fearless. They do the more difficult tricks and all the moves. So I really felt like when I saw them, I would imagine myself being able to be just as good. And so I did skate alongside them. I learned from them. And honestly, I was good. Like it wasn't even just about learning the routine, it was about landing it. And I landed it every time. That may have required me to practice a little bit more or practice more difficult moves a couple of times, but I was always able to get it. And so that doubt and that part of myself that felt like I was never good enough didn't actually exist in the skating rink. Those insecurities that I had immediately fell away. And that imagination really played a huge part in who I was able to become. And so now when I think about my journey as I've continued to grow, I find that that fearlessness has honestly kind of stuck with me. So yes, getting a PhD is so hard, and writing a dissertation, writing a book, starting my career as a professor were things that I never truly imagined that I would be able to do, but I've carried that fearlessness with me, and that is how I've been able to take those lessons and that imagination outside of the skating rink. And so skating taught me about the powerful connection between my body and my mind. That if I imagine myself being able to do something, that my body was more than capable of following through to make it happen. And so in this moment, I became really, really interested, and it became extremely clear to me the ways that Black women and girls have also created their own moments, their own experiences, and their own places to feel like home, as well as their own spaces of refuge where we can imagine, where we can define and remake ourselves, even when those stories aren't actually documented or recorded. And so these reflections make me think about the lost stories of Black women and girls, and I wanted to take part in contributing to our archival presence, the past, the present, and the future. And from there, the Rolling Archives was born. And so, as you listen, I want you to sit with this question: what is one memory that you would want to hold on to forever in your personal archive? And perhaps that also represents when you started to understand who you were. And so I'm very, very honored today to welcome a friend and sister scholar, Dr. Chelsea Bouldin. Dr. Chelsea Bouldin is an assistant professor of Black Studies in the Department of Ethnic, Gender, and Disability Studies at the University of Utah. She earned her PhD in Cultural Foundations of Education from Syracuse University, as well as a certificate of Advanced Studies in Women and Gender Studies. She is working on her first book project, which examines relationships between Black women's imaginative processes of self making, cognition, and archival praxis. Broadly, her scholarship demonstrates the value of nuancing conceptualizations of Black selfhood, democratizing Black women's epistemically rich archive writing. Most recently, her work has been supported in her capacities as a selected Women of Color leadership participant through the National Women's Studies Association, Black Feminist Eco Lab Faculty Fellow, and a 2024-2025 Huntington Library Fellow. And so I've been so inspired by you, Chelsea, and your work. It has been really beautiful to sit with a lot of the ways that you see the archive and are actually reimagining the archive and tying it to the ways that we see and imagine ourselves. I think it is very, very important that Black women don't let go of who we aspire to be, but also that we don't take on the labels and the markings that people often try to place on us. And I just wish that I had understood that a bit more when I was a young Black girl, which is why I wanted to bring you here today so that you can share your journey and your work. So, wherever you are listening from, please welcome Dr. Chelsea Bolden. How are you feeling today?
I am feeling good, better now that I am seeing you and hearing things about your childhood that in this, brief time I didn't even know. So it does speak to, I think, the necessity of us speaking about the ways that we've grown up as Black girls, how that is shaping who we are continually becoming as Black women. So I'm just imagining you at the skating ring. I'm like, girl, I need some lessons, but I'm feeling good. Monday's off to a good start. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited for us to get into this conversation.
Of course. Thank you so much, Chelsea. I also really appreciate that. The skating rink has been everything and a deep inspiration for this work. And so I really, really appreciate that. But I'm also really interested in tapping into your story, especially as your experiences growing up and your experiences in your own childhood. And so, if I can start with a question, what is a core memory for you as a Black girl that stays with you or keeps returning to you in the future?
I am certain that I will be evoking my paternal grandmother a lot in this conversation. And so, one of many memories that lately seem to be returning to me is really a time period more than a single instance of a memory. But it is, well, one, I should say, I grew up with my grandmother living within walking distance from the house I grew up in Virginia. So, I'm from Norfolk, Virginia. The house I grew up in was maybe a half a mile from my grandmother's house. And so the regular presence of which I was at her house and just around her as a child is something that I think until recently I've been taking for granted or had taken for granted. And so I have this memory of being in school, being young, and I knew I could always play the "I'm gonna get my grandma to come get me" card. You know, the slightest tickle in my throat, which really meant I just did not want to be in school in that moment for whatever reason. I knew that my grandmother, who was retired, just took so much pride in being a grandmother and was there at the drop of a dime. And so I can recall, having an excuse to go to the office, like, I need to call home. And my grandma come picking me up, getting there within 30 minutes, and just wrapping me in love. It's sort of a joke now thinking back of how I would have to really say, like, I'm okay, grandma. I don't need anything else. You sure? It would be smothered, and I say that with care and with love, but to the extent it would be like, I am okay. I don't need anything else. And so I think that phase before being allowed to stay at home alone, my grandmother's house is a place that I very much visualize my younger self at, and simply, being on her couch, being given food, there's no way you can ever convince her that you were actually full, no matter how many times you said it or how much you'd actually eaten. And so that's a core memory, simply being at her house as a very young girl and feeling her availability and willingness to show up, I think. And there is a time period where that felt quite condensed because I wasn't allowed to be home alone. And so it's really highlighted in that period too, where my parents, would be at work. And so grandma comes and saves the day. So that's a core memory that I think is further highlighted being far away from home and getting to this point in life where kids are a question, which means care is a question. And to recognize that the way I grew up with my grandmother, again, so available, around, and present, is not something that I would have in this context. And so it's sort of a yearning in the memory itself as well. But that is one. That's one.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that because I don't know what it is about grandmothers, but again, beyond the skating rink, like my grandmother is also a deep inspiration for this work because I grew up in her house and all of us did, my mom, my sister, but she was just so present that once she passed, it was like a absence that still was just not normal. Like I haven't been able to like accept it. And so I think I just try to like still hold on to her. And I feel like that's where she's still like connected to me. But yeah, like how you were talking about the levels of care, the food, like endless amounts of food as much as possible, just showing me really what it looks like to care for someone. And as a mom now, I agree that that doesn't look the same. My mom is very much involved in my daughter's life, but just I think because I had kids older and my mom is older than my grandmother was when she had me, that there's just a certain type of connection that I hope my daughter gets to experience with my mom. But yeah, grandmothers are just really, really precious and so important to this work. And so I'm like really grateful that you brought that up. Similarly, so you talked about like the levels of care that you would receive as a young Black girl, whether that be through your grandmother and family members. I'm wondering how you saw yourself, though. So, how would you describe young Chelsea? And also, how did you come to understand her in this way?
I think more and more these days, I'm continually tapped into who my younger self was. The only thing I ever got in trouble in school for was talking. That's the only thing. They could not shut me up. So I think one, being very curious, being very talkative, I was really given permission and space as a child to lean into those characteristics. A colleague and myself here at University of Utah actually had an event last week for a collective reading of the Combahee River Collective statement. And in that, I was returning to some of the founding members' kind of current work and came across a video. It was an interview that Black women radicals had with Barbara Smith and Demita Frazier. And I was so moved by some of the way they answered the first question, which really got at how they'd come to that work. And both answered saying the context of which they grew up, they never really registered this need for permission to dream big and audaciously. I'm paraphrasing here. And while I dare not compare myself to either of them, there was and is a lot of resonance there for me as far as the way I saw myself was not something I thought about, which was a privilege, right? I think when you feel pretty confident, you're not thinking about the fact that you feel confident. It's just a norm that you can take for granted, like being in any kind of privileged position. And so tying it kind of to the way my grandmother's presence shaped who I was as a child and am, and also my parents. My dad has always been a really big kid, and I think that sort of engagement with me is something that allowed me to, again, just question largely the world. I actually start my dissertation with a story where I'm talking about how my dad and I are sitting on the porch having a conversation. And as a maybe 6-year-old girl, he asks me if I know what metacognition meant. Of course, I don't know what that means. But you can see rhetorically that kind of gets at some of my work thinking about the mental and why that becomes significant. But I use that to say the parameters were never kind of set on this predetermined expectation of what I know, don't know, should do and not. And so while of course I didn't know what that word meant, I do think that story is quite exemplary of the kind of regular conversation I was involved in as a child that made me or asked me to kind of rise to the occasion instead of assume that you don't know, you don't have an opinion. And so I never felt like my voice was not heard. I know that is not to be taken for granted, but at the home, my voice as a little girl felt like it mattered and that I could have an opinion. You know, I still had Black parents where it's like sometimes it's because I said so, right? But at the end of the day, there were also regular opportunities to voice my own thoughts about things. And so maybe that translated to why I couldn't be quiet at school. But kind of positioning that in the now, how I think about that is more so knowing that that's totally not to be taken for granted is rare. And I think also is what laid the groundwork for, accolades that societally people, put on a pedestal, like earning a PhD. But there were certain things like going to school or getting good grades that were simply expected. Like it was not a rewarded kind of thing or this like you're so brilliant. It's like that's what you're supposed to do. But where I also kind of square that experience with today or in this more recent era, decade, if you will, is how I have had to combat the confidence I feel like I grew up with, ironically, getting older. And so some of that is being more in or you know, pursuing a graduate degree. I think the confidence that to me I'd grown up feeling innate with or kind of secondhand begun to be conditioned out. And so to recognize that this is not something I've usually struggled with. And now in this, current or later phase in life is where I'm actually struggling with what it means to show up as my full self, right? I mean, I think that's some of the nature of pursuing doctorate work, where your work itself is always being criticized. You are literally writing and then defend your work. So there are ways that I think about the process itself as shaking confidence because you are always sort of being assessed. And we know that sometimes critique is done in a way that's not full. And so it's, yeah, I would say it's interesting that I kind of look at my younger self like I want to embrace more of her now instead of what I think others' experiences have been, and maybe some of what you share resonates with that too. Of like I've progressively, and I know it's not linear, right? We go through ebbs and flows of how we see ourselves, but it is interesting to me to kind of want to look at my little self and say, hey, how do I bring some of that back? Because it's actually her that I feel like has been shaken a little bit. So from things like, oh, am I gonna wear these big hoop earrings to work? You know, like what being aware of like how I dress to go to work, or thinking twice before I speak. How am I going to say this in a way that will be received? So all this kind of second guessing and just extra labor of thought and perception is really fascinating for me to witness. And I know that that was not always the case.
Yeah, so it sounds like your younger self was almost a bit, you said confident, but also like a freer version of yourself, and I just find that to be so fascinating because I think we have both described like different experiences with our younger self, but also we are still very much so like leaning into them or, returning to them or carrying them with us in some kind of way. And so I just find that to be really important to think about because we sometimes, and I've even been thinking about more so like how are we as black women and even just adults in general just trained to be like, okay, childhood was the past and like now it's just time to let go of that and move on and grow up, but especially for black girls, for many of us, not all of us, that was a level of an experience that we actually had torn away from us way too soon, right? And so I find it very fascinating that a lot of black women are actually returning to their younger selves. They're still holding on to that younger self. And so I'm also just curious how younger Chelsea has kind of set the path for the work that you're doing now. And so I'm interested in what you call Black women's self making and their imaginative processes that they engage. How do you, first, for the listeners, kind of describe what you mean by imaginative self making, especially as you're, sharing like, I have been a certain version of myself, and now I'm surprised by the kind of person that I am now, where I might be like questioning or doubting certain things. But yeah, if you could just talk about a little bit now deeper into your work, but also still thinking about younger Chelsea and this journey of how do we begin to understand this imaginative self making, how you make sense of it, and how you came to this work even in the first place.
Yeah, so I'll start with a moment that I think has really been defining in me coming to this idea of being interested in self making generally. And that is my first Black feminist theory course as an undergraduate student, and having this moment in class where I recognize that the way that I am thinking about myself along gendered and racial lines has more language and awareness than ever. Like, so, I always say I didn't read Words of Fire and lock my hair the next day, right? Like, socialization is obviously a dynamic process, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, there are these moments of which one I just explained or, described, where I distinctly remember this kind of heightened awareness of self, as Aisha Durham talks about, which I cite a lot of that, referring to an epiphanic moment. But I could kind of see myself, recognize in this moment that how I am viewing myself or having language to do that is very particular in this moment. For, we could say for a billion of factors. And so later, being in the dissertation process or before and thinking about the project I wanted to take up, I was really coming back to this moment and being fascinated by the internal recognition or the memory of the internal recognition that I understood myself differently in this given moment. And that while the exact way that I was able to do that could not be charted, nor was I interested in, this sort of precise linear charting of this is why I am this way, but instead recognizing that there were clear inputs in a time in life and taking this course and engaging with literature that allowed me to have language to access a way to describe and understand myself differently. Right? So, this is not radically new. Many foundational literacy scholars talk about this and the role of literature is importantly politicized for our understanding of self. And at the same time, for my own work, what I engaged and what is written about in self making, I argue sort of flattens the complex process that involves the interior self of how we begin to understand ourselves. So, again, to go back to the locked example, or whatever external expression of self that we might equate with gendered expression, racialized expression, all while still, understanding authenticity is something that is not singular, like, and that is always negotiated. But wanting to take a step back and say, well, what are the ways that I have to first understand myself or think about myself before I choose to express it in certain ways? And so that became a really exciting line of questioning for me. And so the imaginative piece lands with that excitement because what my work also names is that self making is not just in response to systems of domination that we are all embedded in. So I'm not saying they're totally distinct either, but it's also this kind of creative medium. It's this currency for which we get to choose. And so most of my work today is on Octavia Butler, which is why I became interested in her practices of what I call cognitive self making. So, this internal understanding of self, because there was a question or assumption to me to be asked of if this is someone producing what we now might call Afrofuturism, which wasn't the language Butler used, but understanding this ability to defy, in some ways, the current realities that we live in what ways might that same or an adjacent kind of frame be used for self, like require of self? So, how might I have to understand myself beyond the conditions of sexism, racism, et cetera, to be able to imagine a world in which I'm not totally confined by those things? And so I'm careful not to suggest a total transcendence from these conditions, but more of a negotiation. I think about the imaginative processes of self as a negotiation tool to understand ourselves more autonomously, right? With more range of freedom. And that literature for me was one input that helped me to do that. And I think that can be kind of described along multiple lines, multiple folds. And so that's the kind of backstory of how I became interested reflexively of what this meant for me, or this process, this referring to a recognition of me thinking about my own thinking about self, referring to the metacognition of self, and then asking, well, what might it mean to study that in someone else? But more importantly, to name that we do, in fact, creatively make ourselves. And that is not simply in response to harmful realities.
Okay, so this is really really powerful the way that you are kind of bringing in the possibilities through our imagination. And so there's one thing to like acknowledge the very reality of like what's happening. So for myself, I would say I feel very constrained by a lot of the things happening in 2026, right? Like a lot of the racism, white supremacy, anti-blackness, like misogynoir, more recently even like the femicide that has been happening amongst black women and girls, right? So that's like the very real things that I also have to navigate and negotiate that may inform how I show up or how I don't show up, whether that be in the classroom, like how open or comfortable do I feel teaching my students, right? Because since so much has happened politically, like I do sometimes fear going into the classroom and being super open and honest because I don't know who's in the room, who might be recording or using this to go against me. You know what I'm saying? And the imagined part of myself is the one who is a professor that goes into the room, tells the truth about what's actually happening, and also trying to push my students to imagine and build otherwise, right? And so I had to kind of sit with myself and be honest, like, it's not doing anybody any good to censor myself in a lot of ways or censor the reality of this moment with my students, but just to be just as open and honest about what is happening and push this imagination. And so I know that you also teach, and you've been teaching a course around Black imagination and the archive. And so I want to bring in this idea of the archive too. We'll talk about that as well a little bit later, but I'm very, very curious about how you have been able to talk with your students about these different realms of Black imagination in particular, but also how does that lead us into understanding what we may know to be the archive in its traditional or non traditional form?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I just want to start by echoing, the very real material and dailiness of what you described, which is ultimately taking care of ourselves and surviving, to say the least, in this moment, which I think is, absolutely not to be discounted. So it's like having these lofty ideas, which are lovely. And at the same time, on a day to day, we have to make it and navigate all the things you just named, which, you know, we could have a whole nother discussion about that. But yeah, I say that to say I hear that, I second that, and simply being present physically and emotionally and, with scholar and professor hat on is taxing. It is taxing and it makes the content of what we are committed to, what we're talking about now, just layered, and it's already kind of heavy lift. Yeah, so this semester I taught a course. Our classes in Monday or Tuesday, tomorrow, days of the week. So we are at the end. We are at the end. And I will say the course has definitely been an immense source of joy. It was not without angst that I began it, so for the reasons you just named. But being in Utah, having a sense of who could be in my classroom, all the things. I will say that I had a fantastic group of students. It was a small class. I think who was in the class reminded me, to your point, too, that I would be doing a disservice to not show up fully and honestly in the ways that I am able to, but also not to over anticipate some of the concerns to the extent that I am self censoring almost in anticipation. And so they surprised me in the best way. They really did, which I think, I mean, I needed that win. I needed that to be the dynamic of the space, but it also was an opportunity for me to sort of look in the mirror and say, what assumptions do I have about the students, even though many times it is necessary to kind of cautiously enter the space for, the spirit of taking care of ourselves. But yeah, the course is fantastic. And so several objectives, if you will, for the course were one, to think about archives and come out understanding that the notion of archives is something that is dynamic, contested, and full of power discrepancies, and that we have to have a conversation about archives and power. The nexus of those things is essentially um, the purpose of the course. And so while we work to unsettle sort of this singular or stagnant definition of archives, we do spend a good portion of the class thinking about institutional archives, to then be able to say, well, why might many of us, especially Black women, Black girls, be committed to archiving, preserving, historicizing our own work in ways that are intentionally separate from these institutions? Um, and so, I told them the goal is to come out of this course with more questions and answers. I'm not suggesting you will have a single answer to anything, but to really just intentionally problematize history. I mean, that ultimately is sort of what it gets at and what narratives that we have. Um, and so we spent a couple of weeks in special collections at our library on campus, and one of the I'll share two activities that we did that I think highlight sort of the importance of mapping on a Black feminist principles in archiving world. And one of those was this sort of faux collection that myself and one of the archivists created. And the goal of for the class was to create an organizing system for the materials. So what would you call this type of material? How would you organize it? Etc. And so in the debriefing, what I asked them to consider is what does it mean that you have had the power to deem what is important, what you call a certain kind of material, how you organize it, and what that means for a future researcher. And so in this case, this work is again in an institution, but we keep coming back to this idea of also narration. So not only presence and absence, as we know, is important in thinking about any critical kind of understanding of archives, because we know many stories and artifacts, etc., Black women and girl are simply missing. They're not there. We do not have them. And what we also have to pay attention to are the ways that what we do have access to is narrated and made accessible in these spaces. And so in this case, we're really focusing on the narration itself. And secondly, an activity or an assignment that they had was creating a museum label of sorts of a of an artifact that was in the special collections that was intent from a collection that purposefully had limited background information. And so to say how what can you say about this ethically? Like how would you choose to negotiate these things and how do you do that using Black feminist principles of insert all the things we've been talking about this semester. And so it is an imperfect process, but I think it is one that asks them to see the ways in which imagination is not neutral. So in practice, both of these experiences and these activities, these assignments, I am asking you to construct a narration about this thing. I'm asking you to make a story. I'm asking you to do that ethically with the amount of information you do have, right? So not total fiction. You are exercising your imagination for making sense of this item that we don't know a ton about. And so in that, what I aim to highlight sort of the nexus of imagination and archives done using Black feminist principles is that it's simply not to be taken for granted the ways that we tell stories about items, preserve them, even when we have access to them. And the problem is not totally one about absence, even though that is absolutely a concern as well.
Mhm. So here it's really important that you are actually teaching your students that imagination or Black imagination is like a political practice as well too. Like it's not just, I actually read this in an article that was written about you at University at Utah, and they talked about how you mentioned Black imagination as a political practice rather than just this flowery idea. So we're not just kind of like out in space, just, oh, daydreaming, imagining, and then it's like, okay, that was fun. And then we walk away, but that this has a real life outcome. And a part of that is in our historical record, right, through our archives. And so the focus, I guess, on the institutional archive is that these are another, going back to that real versus imagine, like this is a real structure that kind of minimizes and like silences a lot of Black women and girls' experiences. And at the same time, that does not mean that because we don't have a level of institutional recognition that we can't imagine what an archive might look like for us too, right? Which is deeply tied to the rolling archives, of course, because I'm not doing this work as like OSU has to stamp it every single time. They may provide the resource for the project, but really I wanted this archive to be a living one, right? That Black women and girls alongside myself could build out so that we feel like we are being represented in the ways that one we want to, that is based in our reality, but also how we imagine ourselves
Mhm.
to be seen. And so something that I actually really want to talk about with you, because a lot of times, especially in the academic realm, but also just in like our general media, social media discourse, a lot of talking about ourselves or looking inward can be seen as a negative. And I feel like you are really encouraging us to sit with self and to sit with our thoughts and to find a sense of validation in how we are thinking, how we are navigating, but also how we are believing in ourselves and like the things that we want to see. And so you talk about how like sometimes our real and imagined self may meet or they may collide. So I'm just really curious about that. If you have an example of what that has looked like, and I think you refer to it as like these epiphanic moments. And so I was just wondering if you could share an example, whether that be personally or from your own work, where that has felt really necessary or maybe even difficult for Black women and girls to just sit with this kind of like two-ness of how they are perceiving or seeing themselves as a part of their self-making that you talk about.
Yeah, I guess I'd start by saying I would argue that anyone who is not interrogating the self as a part of their alleged research process is simply perpetuating the myth of objectivity in research, which we know is dangerous, dangerous territory. And also, to if you have no linkage to your own work personally, I'm not quite sure what the motivation is. And I think that the assumption that an inclusion and a meaningful inclusion of self equates a centering of self just speaks to how folks are not well versed in what it looks like to do that kind of work, if that is the assumption. But I'll say a practice, I guess for me, of the nexus of the imagined self and, maybe a current moment is a daily practice of journaling. I'll share it on a small scale. We might use the word affirmation or there's other language to describe sort of the essence of what I'm referring to when I'm starting my day with a sort of claim to the day that I want. And so in practice, that looks like me sitting on the couch in the mornings, pretty early before I make myself self available to the many demands of the day with my coffee and envisioning the day ahead and what I want for it and who I am in those moments. And so this is again a smaller scale example, but one that is nonetheless powerful. I think to say that my capability to envision myself even 30 minutes from this moment means something. Like our human ability to do that is quite fascinating to me. I'm like, maybe I should have been in neuroscience. I do start my course with this TED talk, which is fascinating about imagination, about the actual neuroscientific capabilities to do this. And so to not take it for granted and think about the complex kind of wirings, et cetera, that are happening in our brain that allow us to do this, I think speak volumes to sort of the way we can direct that energy. And so while I'm not saying my journaling means I'm gonna have a 10 out of 10 day per se, it does allow me to quite literally see myself and anticipate myself in these upcoming moments that is empowering to say the least. I think that it's also sort of the illusion of control a bit that is helpful, I will admit to me. And so I think I would share that and encourage that. The small scale ways that we just quite literally can envision ourselves on a day to day basis when so much is out of our control, I think is a way for me to remain grounded or attempt to remain grounded before, things like turning the news on, listening to the news podcast. Before those things happen, how am I holding myself accountable to myself for envisioning kind of the small interactions that are going to make up my literal day? And again, that's not to remove self again from these larger contexts or pretend that they aren't bidirectionally shaping how I'm able to show up, how I'm able to envision myself, right? I'm not, don't want to discount that at all. And at the same time, there is something to, I think, again, this sort of self accountability to what is in my control and how will I show up for myself while all these things are happening as well.
Yeah, I think that's really important too, is how you're talking about this practice of journaling and making time and space for yourself, but you also talk about like this writing process as a form of archive as well. And
Mhm.
for folks that may not be super familiar, maybe you've been like hiding under a rock or something, but jokingly, but I have come to your article like over and over and over again, where you talk a lot about Black women's self making and your experience in higher education, whether that be your first experience with your first Black woman professor who was teaching Black feminist theory. I find that the writing, like the moments where you take a pause away from like the theoretical conceptual work and you or like the academic writing essentially, and you kind of give us a deep dive into how you are kind of sitting with these moments. As you stated earlier, right? Like a lot of our life experiences come at these different times and points in our lives. And then we kind of circle back to them because they may have made new meaning for us. And so I appreciate how you kind of return to your undergraduate self and like this experience and what it meant to you. But the writing, Chelsea, oh my God, it's just so poetic. It's so beautiful. Like, I literally was reading it and I was just kind of blown away because there's so much of you that, and I don't know if you would say that you imagine yourself as such, but like you are truly an artist too in this work. And so I've just found that to be beautiful. And I'm so grateful that you wrote that piece and that you added those very poetic components of your story and your life and those experiences for you because it resonated. One, it resonated so deeply, but it also was like an example of what it looked like to write our lives in this very archival practice that is inherently a part of Black women's knowing the ways that we see and understand ourselves, but it's also a very challenging component to that because there's so much expectation placed on us as Black women or girls. There's also just a level of constraint that we may feel around not being able to share certain stories or not having the space or capacity to even sit with how I'm feeling because I'm surviving, right? You used that language earlier today, like survival versus being in this state of being able to just sit and imagine and sit with self. And so, all of that to say, I'm really grateful for the work that you are giving to us. And I'm also curious how you navigate so much of wanting to sit with yourself and the tensions that you had to navigate with who you felt called to be or who you've imagined yourself to be in that journey to get to that place versus who the world has only allowed you to be.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. That so generous. I appreciate you. Maybe I will look since we're talking about writing and being in the academy and, the ways that we choose to include ourselves in our work specifically in this space has certain stakes. So I guess I'll speak a little bit to that. The first thing I'll say is that I feel very compelled to mentor in the way that I've been mentored. Like I have had just fantastic Black women mentors in the academy. This is actually one thing I want to write about, plan to write about, because I'm so grateful for the many Black women who have shown up in both or with both care and critique and modeled that there is room for both of those things. I feel like often, at least for me in grad school, there are two extremes. You get this very critical person who, critical being just tearing your work apart with, and that's just that. And then on the other hand, you get, you're so great, brilliant, and nothing needs change. I experienced a lot of that one from particularly white women. And it honestly felt pretty patronizing. And it's not that I don't think some of my work was great, in that phase, but it's also sort of like if you respect me, you've been in the game for how long? There's no way you don't have any suggestions of how to strengthen what I'm doing, right? Or how to push me. And to me, that is an act of love. And so finding and being in community with Black women who gave me my flowers and offered ways to push my work and myself is something I definitely do not take for granted. And I bring that up to say that something like, the piece you're referencing, or even kind of how I negotiate expectations to this day, is looking to that network of mentors still and colleagues who I respect who are those who will give you kind of permission, even when you know you have it, but the kind of reassurance that it is okay to push genres. It is okay to include these snippets of your, like you said, more poetic writing alongside the more theoretical, scholarly lift. And I will also say it is a nod to the discipline which I'm trained in and see myself in, which is Black feminisms. And so I think it's also like looking to that work that has always been genre bending, that has always been sort of awkwardly located or not totally embraced by certain facets of the academy. And so I think about, the one liner from Toni Morrison that gets quoted all the time, which is that racism is a distraction. I think about how all these other things are distractions. So whose permission am I saying is needed to do the thing that doesn't fit neatly in this one box? And so while I might not equate that with racism specifically, but just all of this sort of conditioning, the conditioning processes that sort of strip the self, that say that what you do has to look a particular way or adhere to certain norms. And so instead of being invested in defending my work, I'm more interested in changing the conditions in which I'm engaging, right? So why would I want to submit to this journal that's I'm going to be back and forth with the very foundation of what I'm wanting to do, right? So it's different than I'll strengthen this, sharpen this, and we're on the same, plane with the vision and essence of the work versus I'm defending my very position, my very like inclusion of self. Those are very different things. And so talk about the self accountability again. And I think preservation comes with decision making that I have to hold myself accountable to. So if I'm acting confused of why I'm going to, I don't know, I'm sure there are some great sociology programs out there, but sociology gets a bad rap. So I'll say that. Like I'm going to a super stuffy sociology conference and I'm like, I can't believe they didn't receive my stuff. Well, like, yes, you can. You totally knew that was going to happen. And I'm not saying that excuses it or that there's not room to kind of chip away at some of these spaces that ought be changing, right? That ought be more inclusive, that ought be more critical. That can absolutely be happening. And at the same time, when I think about my own work, and my own self and practices of living that are inextricably related to my work, a core question that I've asked myself and that really framed my decision to go into academia at a time where I'm like, this is going to be knowing the conditions of this place, I had to ask myself, at what parts am I willing to give? What parts am I not? And part of that decision making process for me is being very intentional with the spaces I choose to subject and include my work. And that's not always easy because those spaces are limited. And I do think it is an act of self love to say I'm not going to put myself continually in spaces where I'm not well received. Why would I do that? Why would I do that? And if I am going to do that to work at exchange and know that that's a different game, that's a different commitment, than maybe what I'm doing kind of over here and to the left, if that makes sense, so that these two things can be happening at once. On a practical or more, grounded level, again, that looks like what kind of journals do I want to engage? What kind of reviewers do I want to engage with? What conferences do I want to go to? Whose work do I cite? Where do I place myself and my lineage of the work that I'm engaging in? And so, I mean, I think that right there is really powerful to say I'm building on these scholars' work and not these, and how that simple but not so simple practice is one of archiving, one, but two is it shapes the way the door is or isn't open to do what I want to do, because one is in a defensive posture of these are all the things I'm doing like differently that this person wouldn't agree with XYZ. And so being at a place now, not dissertation mode where yes, I read the things, right? But now I'm not interested in being conversation with you. I can, tell you why I'm not doing this particular thing, but I'm choosing to be over here is something that I'm really committed to doing, and I think is the only way that I could last in this space for some time.
Yeah, I think you're speaking a lot to like the scary decisions that we sometimes have to make, but that are, you said self-accountable. I would use that word or that language of accountability, but also that kind of keep us true and like whole. And I know that all of us aren't always able to easily make these decisions, but I think that it kind of helps us sustain in the long run. And I actually appreciate that you're like, well, this is also a part of the archive, right? Like this is a part of me continuing to like expand on whether it be the work or the things that folks have done before me. Initially that made me think about Beyonce and of course like Cowboy Carter and just the way that she has tried to like dip in and out of the space of like country music and been completely pushed right back out. And so she's like, you know what? I'm gonna do it myself and I'm gonna do it in a way that feels very authentic, right? Like bringing up the folks that even allowed me to create a country album. And I think for myself, especially when you talk about making these decisions around to what extent or what level am I going to allow myself to participate in this thing, or whether it's censor or silence myself. I would say at my first job, I was pushed in a lot of ways to do away with this black girl thing because it just seemed to be quote unquote discriminatory or it left out certain voices. And I was like, who am I to claim that this is something that is so deeply important to me? One, on like a personal level, but a political level. I've made a commitment to young black girls, both within and outside of these academic like places, and then just for a job and just for a paycheck, I'm going to throw that all away to make the institution comfortable. That was something that obviously I was not comfortable with. And so I ended up leaving that institution. But that was a very scary choice because what if I don't get another job? What if I don't have another paycheck? What if like things come up in my family that I need to take care of, you know? And so, but it was just something that I refused to allow to silence some work that already doesn't get enough recognition in and of itself, being black girlhood studies, black feminism. And so I too have learned so much from black feminism. Is essentially at the core of everything. One, because I think that folks kind of see it as this very academic thing, but black feminism is actually something that we can take into the world to really like shape our orientation to, whether it be our career, our family lives, right? Just so much that it's resonant with. And it's so deeply tied to what you're talking about as we think about imagining, right? Like Black feminism is about imagining something anew, something other, something that will allow us the space to live freely. So I really do appreciate that. And I actually love how you have connected it to the archive. Like this is a part of that archival work that so many folks going all the way back to, maybe it's the Harriet Tubmans or the Sojourner Truths, right? Like let it be known that no is a full sentence and I'm going to let you know that I don't have to stay here. I'm leaving. I'm taking my people, my community with me, and we're going to build something together anew. So I really appreciate that. I'm curious though for folks that still feel like, oh, this is a great conversation, but what can this do for me? Like, how do I actually act on this? Like, how do I make this real? I'm curious if you could share for Black women and girls or share with Black women and girls who are really interested in thinking about their own self making, sitting with their ways of knowing and how they see themselves or what they aspire or desire for themselves, or maybe even just getting into a little bit of an archival practice that is just in the everyday ways that you have been describing. What might that look like? Where would you encourage them to begin, or a source of inspiration?
Yeah. I would first ask everyone to imagine a time that they read something, listened to something, or watched something that they just felt very seen. Like something where the experience really resonated and you just really took something from that, right? And then to know that your life is that for someone else, has the potential to be that for someone else. And so when I you talk about archives as being epistemically rich, just a big word for saying like there's educative potential in these documents that get housed away. Like there's something so generative and rich, possibly, likely, in these really ordinary and mundane writings that someone wrote that, for instance, say I go through this box, I pick up this one sticky note, and there's a sentence on it that just really lands for me in that moment and that has some sort of healing property. Like, for whatever reason, I really needed that in that moment. I feel so seen, I feel so connected. In that moment, we're sort of transcending time, transcending place, right? This might not even be someone who's any longer alive. They're probably not, and so there's connection that's made again across time, generation, location, not to mention the ways that who knows how that'll sit with me, and then the multifold way, like I might take that little snippet with me and then share it with someone else. I just think about the ways that we all hold stories, hold knowledge that has that's great for ourselves as we know ourselves, continually know ourselves, but also for someone else. So, just a homegirl chat, like, "You're going through that too?" Right? But that happens, I think, in all these different kinds of spaces. I would say it's just not to take for granted that all of the intricacies of our stories, our lives, and the ways that they'll show up have the potential to be impactful in all these unknown and beautiful ways that we might not be able to imagine always. And then when you see it or experience it, it's quite beautiful. And so in that, what I think is sort of a living process of what we're describing is archiving, which is really a nod to one, naming that your stories are important. Our stories are important and they are worthy of preservation, even if we have no idea why, like for what reason. It's sort of leaning into the fact that the ways that this material, this story can be accessed or used doesn't have to have a defined goal. It doesn't have to have a single goal of this is why I'm writing this. And so in that action too of simply knowing the important is this demand and recognition of our intrinsic knowledge and intrinsic importance that doesn't have to be for the goal of this any singular or assumed grandiose thing, but that it has inherent importance and that sort of opening ourselves up to the possibility of those stories being shared. And so, yeah, I think in the daily that looks like talking, sharing a story. I think it looks like jotting down something that seems silly to you, but that you might return to later. I think it means embracing the vulnerability that is sometimes writing. It doesn't have to be in the process of writing, but I will say for myself, just sometimes journaling. It's like, am I really gonna put this on paper? This, like, what if someone finds this? I will say when I travel, I always keep my journal in my carry-on. I've said if my checked bag gets gone, like I'm gonna keep the notebook with me. So I think there's no example too small of how you do this, this being archiving in the daily life, because it's really a matter of you living and knowing that the stories coming out of that living are worthy of preservation and have inherent value and that will inevitably be of appreciation to someone in this current moment and or in the future, and you might not be able to fathom that, but that it's true. It's true. I don't know, in my experience, it is true.
Yeah, I love this like connection that you're making about like how we can just do archiving in a simple everyday practice that then leads to one, our imaginations, our imaginative worlds, but also like this deep self-making that isn't just about ourselves, but it is about our community, right?
Mhm.
So really learning to hold on to those very small stories. I remember even starting the Rolling Archives, I was like, I have so many ideas, but I'm gonna go back to the photo album. Like all the Black families got the photo album. And like, so
Right.
I was able to go back through those images and like some of my old writing as a little girl and just, some of those things. But even now, present day, I don't intentionally journal, but I do have a ton of like notebooks. And sometimes I'll like go back to a notebook and I'm like, I can't believe I wrote that as like a task on my to-do list. And it's just a thing that I do now. Like it's just a part of my life, like preparing for this one class. And it's like, I've taught the class, it's been successful, it's been great, you know? And so I think just as you're saying, like hold on to those little everyday moments, like every part of our lives matters so much and matters so much more for our community as Black women and girls too. So thank you, Chelsea. I do want to ask you, as we're getting ready to wrap up, I feel like I can talk to you all day about all of this stuff. This has been such a beautiful conversation. I did just want to roll it back to where we started. So going back to young Chelsea, I appreciate you allowing her to be in this conversation with us today. But if you could actually speak to your younger self, the young Black girl who would one day do this work, what do you think she would feel about everything that you have done, that you're continuing to do? What might she say to you? And, or on the flip side of that, what might you actually want to say to her?
Yeah, I think I'll start with the last part of the question, which is what would I say to her? And it is sort of to mirror back to the early part, which is, set your own goalposts alongside these that are more obviously recognized by society. So what little things matter to you? Jot those down, make those a part and alongside of these other maybe more legible kinds of wins, if you will, but nothing too small for what you want to do. What would my young self be thinking about me? I think she would say, "Girl, you live in Utah? What is in Utah?" I think she would be proud that, I've stuck with the travel bug, have embraced change, and be proud that I've remained, I still think, pretty childlike and silly. That is a commitment I have to not let that go. I just, you know, want to stay as light as possible. But I think she would still see herself in me. And so that makes me happy.
Yeah, I love that so much. Can you tell the listeners to what you're working on now and then also where we can go to learn more about you, but also to stay connected?
Yeah. In addition to this book that is getting written at some point, I'll share a smaller project that I am returning to this summer because it also highlights some of our conversation today, and I'm really excited about it. So, my grandma, Lorna, who I mentioned, passed just under 2 years ago, and I have many of her letters. We wrote letters to one another, but also I have many of her letters, particularly one she wrote to my grandfather when he was away, and they wrote tons of love letters back and forth. And so I have this box of these letters. I've not fully opened them or read them, but I'm going to do something with these letters to our point about archiving. I love letter writing. And so I don't have a full vision for what that project will look like yet, but that is something upcoming that'll also be kind of a two-in-one nod to her in my life, continue to be my life. That's her up there. I know we are listening via audio, but I have a photo of my grandmother in my office that stays near me. So yeah, that's a smaller project. I'm excited to get in there and open those letters and read her beautiful cursive. I am sort of on socials. I'm trying to be on there a little more regularly. So you can find me on Instagram just at my name at chelsea.bouldin. And then, of course, via email, also my name, chelseabolden at utah.edu. I don't have a beautiful website like Ashley. Oh my gosh, your website is gorgeous. So maybe
Thank
that'll
you.
be a fun project at another phase of this career. But yeah, that's what I'm up to for now.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Chelsea. This has been truly an amazing conversation. I feel like I learned so much more about you, your life, your experiences, your work, and it's just been really, really beautiful. And so I am so, so grateful. And if there's anything I'm going to keep returning to, it is really just thinking about those very mundane, everyday moments that we should hold on to, jot it down, document it in some way, shape, or form. And so I'm just so grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ashley. This has been amazing.
All right. Thank you so much again to Dr. Chelsea Bouldin for being here and sharing all of the wonderful things about her work around self making, around imagination, and around the archive. And I think for myself, I'm just going to continue to personally hold on to that young Black girl at the skating rink who was fearless and just believed in every single part and every single bone of her body and all that she was capable of to be enough. And so I want to thank you for listening to today's episode of the Rolling Archives podcast. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at The Rolling Archives, all one word, or on our website at therollingarchives.org. Also, please rate, review, subscribe, and like or share if you are on YouTube, if you enjoyed this episode today. And we'll be back with another episode in 2 weeks. Until then, may we keep rolling towards all the places and spaces that keep us whole and allow us to return to ourselves. All right, y'all. Bye bye.